Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Foreign Minister Datuk Sri Hishammuddin Hussein was recently criticised over his big brother remark during a press conference in Beijing with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi. Now, following the blowback, Hishammuddin released a statement that he was merely practicing Asian values, and he said that he was showing respect for, quote, a more senior foreign minister and therefore considered an elder brother to him personally. Now, was this a major diplomatic faux pas, or were his critics overreacting? Over the next 30 minutes, we'll be speaking to foreign policy analysts about the dynamics shaping our China policy. Thomas Daniel joins us first. He's a fellow in the Foreign Policy and Security Studies program at ISIS Malaysia. Thomas, good evening. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Now, why do you think Hishammuddin Hussein's comment had created such an uproar in Malaysia? I mean, I'm wondering whether there's a particular sensitivity about this, particularly in a Malaysian context.
Hi, guys, and thanks for having me. It was an interesting comment. As to why it created an uproar, well, I think perhaps there was a realization that on the importance of Malaysia's bilateral relationship with China and how this relationship is being framed. China is a major regional power. It's poised to become a global power if it isn't already. And it's an important bilateral partner for Malaysia. And this is a very visible relationship, both from a domestic and international perspective. They are our biggest trade partner. They have a very visible role in some of the biggest infrastructure projects. Okay. And it's one of the countries that we have a territorial dispute with. But if I could just add one more thing, I think, from a very objective perspective, looking at how politically fractured and how divided this country is from 2018 plays into it a bit, I think. So we see folks from both sides of the divide not letting a good opportunity to muddy the waters at their opponent's expense.
Okay. You said, Thomas, that it's an interesting comment. Why was it interesting to you?
Well, what was really interesting from it was the sort of reaction it generated. In terms of the comment itself, personally, I don't think it's that big a deal. It doesn't impact the bilateral relationship at all. I'm pretty sure diplomats and policy practitioners whose job it is to manage the relationship were not confused and they know exactly how to do their job. So I think it's the reaction that was more interesting.
Okay.
Thomas, political scientist James Chin in The Diplomat, wrote a piece on this, and he said that considering Hishammuddin's, role in the MH370 issue and so on and so forth, that he believes that under this foreign minister, there is in fact a tilt towards China, despite the apparent public stand of neutrality. Would you agree?
I don't think so. But I think what Professor James mentioned is extremely interesting because in the sort of environment that I deal with, it's very common to see this perception of a tilt of Malaysia in favor of China. I don't know whether I agree with that entirely, but it seems to be the image that we're giving out, for better or for worse, and it's something that we might want to keep in mind.
Okay. Does the fact that China has a lot of investments in Malaysia, as you pointed out a little bit earlier, does that do anything in terms of shifting the balance of the relationship between our two countries?
I think it makes the relationship very, very valuable to Malaysia. China is Malaysia's biggest trading partner. It is an extremely valuable relationship, and especially in this environment, moving forward from the pandemic, a lot of policymakers here do see us working with China to work our way out of this pandemic. This figures heavily into the minds of policymakers and will influence how we structure our bilateral relationship with them.
Okay.
Thomas, it's also been noted that, over the decades, Malaysia has tried to be, as it were, friends to everybody, right? A friend to everybody, both the U.S. that used to underpin the security architecture of the region, and now as China emerges as a new force, especially in the South China Sea with its 9-dash line claims, that Malaysia is hard-pressed to maintain this neutrality. Do you see any thinking about how to recalibrate Malaysia's relationship, considering that China is increasingly demanding more loyalty or demanding a tilt towards itself, while on the other hand we have now, U.S. maybe poised to return to the region with a clearer sense of what it wants to do here?
That is an excellent question, to which if I had the answer to, I would be extremely pleased. I think, from my perception, China has been showing a very, very different face to some countries in Southeast Asia based on how how these countries manage their bilateral relationship with China. I think the overwhelming sentiment among foreign policy makers in Malaysia is that despite the dispute in the South China Sea, and it is a very important dispute and a very important part of the bilateral relationship, the relationship is overwhelmingly positive, and this is something that I think both capitals would want to emphasize on and work on. So sort of compartmentalizing the relationship.
Okay.
In regards to what you first brought up, whether Malaysia should be friend to all, that is, again, extremely interesting. I don't know if that is the most practical approach. I mean, it sounds great when you sort of declare it as a matter of policy, but how do you implement it? That's another question altogether.
Right. Can I come back to China and it's the face that it's showing the world? And I'm wondering whether that face, that position has evolved, particularly looking at recent months. There's been escalating tensions over the Xinjiang cotton. I'm wondering what that controversy, what that increasing tension tells you about China's relationship with Western powers. I've read comments by Chinese officials that say they say the era of bullying, to quote them, by foreign powers is now over. Are you seeing more assertiveness come up from China in the way they're dealing with the rest of the world?
I think China is being increasingly assertive, but it depends to who. Now, this narrative on bullying is extremely important. There's a lot of play on the narrative of China's century of humiliation, that it's not going to allow itself to be bullied by any external powers, especially Western powers. It's an extremely powerful motivator in and a constant theme of nation building by the CPC itself. I think how it's been extremely strident against countries that sort of questions or that sort of interferes with what China sees as its core interests. What's happening in Xinjiang is one of them. What's happening with regards to how other countries handle their relationship with Taiwan is another one. These are extremely touchy issues for China. I guess another issue that that really comes to mind is countries that question the responsibility and origin of the pandemic. You've seen China react very stringently against countries that sort of bring this up.
Thomas, I wonder if you can help us understand where foreign policy in Malaysia is made. In some countries, there seems to be a marketplace of ideas with journals, airing different perspectives on how that country might go about dealing with, its diplomatic relations. In Malaysia, is it primarily centered in the office of the foreign minister, or is it a strong prime minister? In the case of Dr. Mahathir, seemed to have led the foreign policy initiative for his 22 years. Where does it happen in Malaysia?
That's interesting. When I joined this line of work, I was told very much that foreign policy in Malaysia, for better or worse, is largely a preserve of the elite. I think in my relatively short 6 years of doing this, that has changed somewhat. You are seeing the increasing democratization of foreign policy. You're seeing a lot more foreign policy issues being discussed out in the public. Now, whether this is an informed discussion or not is another story, but they are being discussed, and policy makers are being forced to take that into account, are being forced to take into account what the electoral sentiments are. For example, I think we saw this play a factor in the 2018 general elections. I think, to answer your question, it's still very much decided at a very elite level, but the space is increasingly opening up.
Can I ask you? Can I ask you
that's
a quick
good thing,
follow-up?
but it also brings some challenges.
Right. Can I ask you a quick follow-up on that? You talked about public sentiment. I like the idea of this democratization of foreign policy. I'm not sure whether you think it's a positive thing or not. But what is the kind of public sentiment and public awareness specifically about Malaysia's relationship with Beijing? I mean, when the public backlash we saw, particularly online on social media, about the Big Brother remark, that seemed to get quite a lot of traction. But how would you say Malaysians' awareness about foreign policy or diplomacy, particularly with China, how much does that resonate with Malaysians, you reckon?
I think there is, there's been a baseline awareness of the importance of China as Malaysia's bilateral partner. There is general awareness that China is now, if not already a superpower, at least a major regional power. I think these things are very much ingrained in the mind of the public. And then you've got competing issues about how the Malaysian public sees Chinese investment in Malaysia. You've got people-to-people ties. You've got sort of the aspect of the dispute in the South China Sea. You've got Xinjiang, which can be potentially problematic to the relationship. It's a bit of a mixed bag. I think there is a realization that China is extremely important, which would mean that there will be a lot more interest into how we manage our relationship with China.
All right. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We really do appreciate your time and you sharing your insights with us. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
We'll be back in just a couple minutes, so stay tuned to consider this.
Salam Ramadan Al-Mubarak.
Induknya adalah Melayu.
Balik kepada Islam. This is orang yang membuat polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita, sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
Perang COVID-19 masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19. Social distancing, face mask, follow these steps, this SOP with the utmost discipline. Together, we can flatten the curve.
Bila sentuh soal berita, tiada masa untuk tunggu. Kepada anda kami bawakan fakta, susulan dan kupasan yang terkini. Tiada drama dan tiada pengulangan. Usah tunggu lama-lama. Awani 745 lebih awal dari biasa.
Kini berwajah baru.
Ini pula susulan khas pesawat Back Air di Kazakhstan. Pesawat berkenaan dilaporkan tergelincir 2 kali.
Notifikasi berita terkini dan navigasi mudah. Podcast dikemas kini dengan berita dan program.
Rebirth, Reformasi, Resistance and Hope.
Serta video tanpa had dengan scroll tanpa henti. Buat turun aplikasi baru Astro Awani sekarang.
Semua yang terjadi adalah berita, tetapi tiada siapa yang boleh bawakan yang terkini dan tergempar seperti kami.
Dilihat hanya memberi wang tanpa matlamat yang tepat. Dia tidak melakukan apa-apa kesalahan.
Untuk mendapatkan jawapan yang bermakna, kita perlu soalan yang tepat.
Amat sedih dengan apa yang berlaku kat atas.
Tiada ruang untuk berita palsu.
Negara kita telah merekodkan kes harian baru sebanyak
hanya fakta yang diberikan.
Amat penting untuk meneruskan perjuangan negara melawan pandemik ini.
Sentiasa memastikan suara anda, suara rakyat didengari.
Kenapa?
Membawakan apa yang penting di mana sahaja anda berada.
Kerana kita hendak putuskan rantaian jangkitan.
Belanjawan dan pendekatan bertimbangkan.
Hi, thanks so much for staying with us. You're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Let's continue our conversation about the dynamics reshaping our China policy. Oh Isan joins us now. He's a senior fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Isan, thank you for joining us this evening. If I may begin our conversation with the Xinjiang cotton issue, I'm wondering what the escalating tensions over the Xinjiang cotton issue tells you about China's relationship with international companies, that are there, that want access to their markets. How are you reading this controversy?
Well, I think a lot of this global conglomerates, for example, in garments and so on the one hand, they do need their factories in China for making these garments, which they then sell to both within China as well as the rest of the world. On the other hand, of course, in the, shall we say, the mother countries of many of these corporations, such as H&M and so on, there are people who are obviously very concerned about what is happening in Xinjiang. There are various accusations, there are various allegations and so on. So in order very often to placate the sentiments of the, shall we say, the popular sentiments in the mother countries of these various corporations such as H&M and so on, they would have to declare themselves, for example, not to use the cotton from Xinjiang and so on. But that, of course, would hurt their business in China, in which they sell, shall we say, the bulk of their products, the garments, and also they have various factories and also using, obviously, again, the cottons from Xinjiang. So now, of course, they will have to source their cottons somewhere else.
Right. I just think it's interesting, Isan, that this has become a geopolitical event now. But more interesting to me has been China's reaction to this, the kind of tit-for-tat sanctions we have on one hand, the EU and the US and Britain and other Western countries, and now we have a similar counter-attack by China. How are you seeing this play out? Does this tell you anything new about how China is presenting itself to the rest of the world?
Well, China is now presenting itself as potentially not only a rising power, but indeed a major power in its own right. And of course, then when some other corporate entities, such as I think in this case H&M and so on, would try to, for example, take a stand in, for example, not using the cottons from Xinjiang and so on, China, in its own opinion, as a major power, would have to retaliate in kind. And in this case, it is, for example, the boycott of various H&M products. And whether we like it or not, China is now, shall we say, the major consumer market for a lot of major brands around the world. So if these major brands do not toe China's line, they indeed risk this sort of, shall we say, market retaliation from China. Yeah.
What's interesting, I think, to follow on this is Muji and Uniqlo did in fact advertise that they were getting their fabrics from Xinjiang on the basis that Xinjiang cotton is seen to be of high quality. And I wonder if, the tendency in the West to want to anchor products and marketing around human rights issues is something that we're going to see an eclipse of in the near future, as it becomes increasingly clear that countries like China won't play along with these rules.
Well, China has not been sort of responding to this sort of boycotts and so on. I think not only recently, but since at least if I could remember the mid-1990s, when, for example, the U.S. under the Clinton administration, they were in a sense forced to dissociate human rights issue from trade issues with China, right? In granting China the so-called most favored nation trading status. Whether you like it or not, China, with the world's largest population and a rising middle class, is indeed a very huge market for a lot of companies, be they from the West or from China itself. So if you do not submit to China's needs and wants, you certainly do risk such boycotts or counter boycotts from China.
Yeah. Isan, can I ask you about what you make of the comments coming up from officials in China? Comments or remarks like no more of this era of bullying, that the century of humiliation is now over. What are you making of comments like that? I find it very interesting. Do you?
Well, of course, the current Chinese administration is associating the, shall we say, Western treatment of China with, for example, the Opium War and so on, which happened, I think, more than 1.5 centuries ago. And as long as China has the market clout to sort of recruit this sort of various Western companies, so it would, of course, be able to continue to have its way, whether you like it or not.
But doesn't China also depend on markets in the West? I mean, isn't there a very fundamental interdependence between these major markets, China depending on the US market, Europe, and vice versa?
Well, they to a certain extent, they do, but increasingly, I will give you one example. For example, when I used to go to China before the COVID pandemic, I would find that actually the domestic brands of T-shirts in China, they are selling much higher prices than those Western brands. For example, they would sell typical T-shirts in the range of even 1,000 renminbi, whereas a typical Western branded T-shirt would sell, let's say, maybe 100 or 200 renminbi. So I think they're increasingly sort of proud of their own market capacity and size. And with that, of course, they would be able to afford, they could afford to say no to the Western markets and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you that China has the upper hand in terms of market clout. It also has the financial firepower, financial investment firepower, one that Malaysia has benefited from. I'm wondering, given everything that you've said to us tonight, Isan, then how should Malaysia position itself, in terms of us being a middle power with vulnerabilities in our economy? What do you see Malaysia having to do to secure our relationship with China while protecting our sovereignty?
Well, first of all, I need to protect myself by saying things publicly, and therefore I will quote our distinguished Prime Minister in announcing yesterday that the government is short of money nowadays, right? When you are short of money, therefore, logically, you could not be playing this sort of middle power role very effectively. All these issues about, calling the foreign minister of China being the big brother and so on, I think it's, in a sense, a very pragmatic move, whether we like it or not. Some of us do, some of us don't. But the fact remains, whichever major powers, China or some of the Western powers, if they are able to invest in a major manner in this country, I think, at least personally, I would call them not only big brother, might even call them father or even grandfather.
Isan, well, I think we'll have to take a pause on that suggestion. But I want to come back. More seriously, you know, one of the ways in which the public talks about China is that it imagines it as a monolith. It's a singular entity, and that it operates, whether politically or in economic instances, with a single-mindedness. And what researchers seem to be suggesting is that there are actually much more complex layers and levels which these games are being played in terms of investments and such. How do we go forward in a much more nuanced way with our relationship, not just to China and Beijing, but also to, you know, various provincial level governments and state-owned enterprises that might be operating in Malaysia, but not necessarily at the behest of Beijing?
Yes, I totally agree with you. There is a stiff competition, for example, among the various provinces in China and even among the various major municipalities in China, not to mention among the various China state-owned enterprises which are operating in Malaysia. I still remember vividly when previously I was working in government, there was one Chinese state-owned enterprise which was then operating in Malaysia. They came to me with a complaint that they have been bullied by another company. I thought it must have been some other, shall we say, Western companies bullying them, right? Then they complained to me that it was indeed another state-owned enterprise from China which was bullying them, right? So, of course, we need to be cognizant of all these nuances in China's domestic and internal power struggles and so on. But that would presume that we really have you know, a huge amount of knowledge about what is happening in China. So until such time as we are able to train such diplomatic personnel, for example, who are cognizant of the various struggles and competitions within China, well, what can we do except to once again, you know, calling China the big brother?
Right. Ihsan, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, and we appreciate you sharing your insights with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. But before we leave you, a quick reminder. Don't forget to get all the latest news and information on COVID-19 vaccines at astroawani.com and the Astro Awani app. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off the evening.
We'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.